In the autumn of 1848, on a cold afternoon at the edge of Niagara Falls, a tall, tired lawyer from Illinois stood at the railing with the spray soaking into his coat and wrote down a sentence that, if you read it today exactly as he left it, will stop you where you stand. He had just finished weeks of campaigning. He was on his way home. He was not famous yet. He was a one-term congressman that almost no one outside his own state could have named, and he would not become the man we remember for another 12 years. But standing there, looking at the water, he took out a half-sheet of foolscap and wrote, in his own hand, that the eyes of a species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, had gazed upon this same waterfall, exactly as his own eyes were doing now. He did not write it as a question. He did not write it as a legend. He wrote it the way you would write down the date, as a fact, as something everyone already knew. That sentence is real. It exists. It is held today in the Library of Congress, printed in the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, and you can read it for yourself in about 90 seconds. And the strangest part is not that he wrote it. The strangest part is what happened to it after he died, why almost no one alive has ever heard it, and what it tells us about a belief that an entire nation once held with total confidence and then, within a single lifetime, agreed to forget. Before we go any further into this, take a moment now and tap subscribe. What you are about to hear is not a hoax and it is not a theory. It is documented, it is sourced, and it is sitting in the public record in plain sight. The reason you have never heard it is not that it was hidden. The reason is stranger than that, and we are going to get to it. But stories like this only reach the surface when channels like this one keep growing. So tap subscribe, leave the notifications on, and let us continue. To understand the sentence, you have to understand the man who wrote it, because that is where the mystery actually begins. By every account we have, Abraham Lincoln was one of the most relentlessly skeptical minds of his generation. His own law partner, William Herndon, told a story about Niagara that has survived for more than a century. Herndon visited the falls sometime after Lincoln did, and when the two men spoke about it, Herndon went on at length in the romantic fashion of the age, all rush and roar and rainbows. When he ran out of adjectives, he asked Lincoln what had struck him most deeply about the falls. And Lincoln, who had stood in the same spot and felt the same spray, answered with a question of his own. The thing that struck him most forcibly, he said, was where in the world did all that water come from? Herndon remembered that line for 40 years, because it told him everything about how Lincoln's mind worked. It refused beauty. It refused awe. It went straight past the spectacle and hunted for the cause. This is the man. A man who looked at the seventh wonder of the continent and immediately started doing the arithmetic. A man who later, in the very same fragment about Niagara, calmly estimated the tonnage of water going over the edge every minute and the force it would take to lift it back up. He was not a dreamer. He was an engineer of his own thoughts. He did not believe things lightly, and that is exactly why the giant sentence matters so much. Because a man like that does not write down a fairy tale and call it history. When Abraham Lincoln wrote that extinct giants had once gazed on Niagara, he was not inventing anything and he was not being poetic for the sake of it. He was repeating as settled knowledge, something that the educated people of his time genuinely believed to be true. He was telling you, across 170 years, what an entire country thought it knew about its own land. So what did they think they knew? That is the next door we have to open, and behind it is one of the largest forgotten chapters in American history. When European settlers pushed west into the Ohio Valley and down the Mississippi in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they found something they could not explain. The ground was covered with mounds, enormous earthworks, geometric enclosures laid out with a precision that implied mathematics, embankments that ran for miles, conical hills of packed earth that held burials, and great flat platforms that had clearly once supported structures. There were tens of thousands of them. Some were larger than anything the settlers had built themselves. They were old, they were sophisticated, and they were everywhere. And the settlers looked at these monuments, and then they looked at the native peoples living around them, and they made a decision that would poison American thinking for the next century. They decided that the people in front of them could not possibly have built the things beneath their feet. This is the heart of what historians now call the mound builder myth, and you have to understand how completely it took hold. It was not a fringe idea. It was the mainstream. It was in the newspapers, in the lecture halls, in the books that educated men read by candlelight. The theory held that the mounds had been raised not by the ancestors of living Native Americans, but by a vanished, superior, lost race, a people who had risen, flourished, built wonders, and then disappeared from the earth before the tribes the settlers knew had ever arrived. And who was this lost race supposed to be? The answers were as wild as you can imagine. Some said the mounds had been built by wandering Vikings. Some said stray Welshmen who had crossed the ocean centuries before Columbus. Some said the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And some, pointing to bones pulled out of the mounds that they swore were larger than any living man's, said the builders had been giants, an ancient race of titans who walked the continent in the deep past and left their monstrous skeletons sleeping in the earth. Now hold on to that detail, the bones, because we are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to change how you hear everything that follows. This is the world Abraham Lincoln grew up inside. As a young man in Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois, he lived in the very heartland of the mounds. He would have walked past them. He would have heard them discussed by the kind of self-taught, book-hungry men he spent his life among. The idea of a vanished race of giant builders was not exotic to him. It was the ordinary furniture of an educated American mind in the 1840s. So when he stood at Niagara and reached for the deep past, for the immense stretch of time before recorded history, the image that came to him was the most natural one available. The giants whose bones filled the mounds had stood here too. Everyone knew about the giants. He was simply placing them in time. But there is a problem with the giants. And the problem is the reason this whole story has been so quietly buried. There were no giants. The bones were real, but the giants were not. And the gap between those two facts is one of the strangest journeys in the history of American belief, because it took more than 100 years and the destruction of an entire national fantasy to close it. Let us start with where the bones actually came from. The mounds were burial sites, among other things, and when settlers dug into them, often carelessly, often with no understanding of what they were destroying, they did find human remains. Occasionally, they found remains of unusually tall individuals. And here is the first thing the myth got wrong. A genuinely tall skeleton is not the skeleton of a giant. Modern anthropologists who have examined the surviving accounts point out that the so-called giants, when they were real people at all, were almost certainly individuals with rare conditions like gigantism or acromegaly, hormonal disorders that can make a person grow past 7 feet. Tall, yes. Remarkable, yes. But human, entirely, ordinarily human. That is the charitable explanation. The cases that had any basis at all. The rest is worse and stranger, because by the middle of the 19th century, the giants of the mounds had become a national industry of invention. Newspapers across the country ran story after story announcing the discovery of enormous skeletons. 8 feet tall, 10 feet tall, 12 feet tall. Some accounts went further and described double rows of teeth, skulls the size of washtubs, thigh bones longer than a man's whole leg. These stories ran in the same papers, on the same pages, as advertisements for miracle elixirs and opium-laced patent medicines. They were not journalism in any sense we would recognize. They were entertainment, and they sold papers. And an editor who needed to fill a column on a slow week could always reach for another giant. And then there were the outright frauds. The most famous arrived in 1869, just a few years after Lincoln's death, when workers digging a well on a farm in Cardiff, New York, unearthed a petrified man over 10 feet tall. People came from miles around and paid to see it. The Cardiff Giant, they called it. It was a sensation. It was also a complete fabrication. a block of gypsum carved into the shape of a man and buried by a con artist, precisely so that it could be dug up again and gawked at for money. The fact that thousands of people wanted so badly to believe in it that they paid for the privilege tells you everything about the grip the giant myth had on the American imagination. So we have a country that found real mounds, built by real and sophisticated people, and convinced itself that those people were a vanished race of giants, and then spent decades feeding that conviction with exaggeration, sensationalism, and fraud. And in the middle of all of it, before the worst of the hoaxes, a thoughtful young congressman stood at a waterfall and wrote the belief down in his own hand as simple fact. Now we arrive at the part of your title, the line that was cut before the speech was ever delivered. And here is where the truth turns out to be sharper than the legend. Because the speech was never delivered for a reason almost no one knows. There was no speech. Lincoln's giant sentence was never part of an address he gave to Congress. It was never read aloud to a crowd. It was never published in his lifetime at all. What he wrote at Niagara was a fragment, a private set of notes, possibly the beginnings of a lecture he was turning over in his mind, scratched onto a couple of half sheets of paper and then folded away and kept. He never finished it. He never delivered it. As far as we can tell, no one read it while he was alive. The sentence about the giants sat in his private papers, silent, for the rest of his life and beyond. It only reached the public after he was assassinated. His former secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, the two young men who had worked closest to him in the White House, went through his papers in the decades after his death and eventually published the fragment. And here the story takes one more strange turn, because even they did not know quite what to do with it. They could not date it. They guessed it had been written around 1850 with no real evidence, and printed it under a vague label. It was not until the great editor Roy Bassler reassembled Lincoln's collected works in the 20th century that the fragment was correctly placed in 1848. On that trip home from the Niagara railing, so the line was never cut from a speech. The speech never existed. The line was simply never spoken, because Lincoln folded it into a drawer and the world moved on. That is why you have never heard it. Not because anyone hid it, because it was a private thought, written down by a private man on a cold afternoon about a belief that the world was about to abandon, and the world did abandon it. That is the last door, and it is the most important one, because it is the door that explains why the giants vanished from American memory almost as completely as they had once filled it. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, real archaeology was finally being done on the mounds. Trained excavators, careful measurement, actual study of the artifacts and the earthworks and the remains. And the verdict that came back was as clear as it was unwelcome to the people who had loved the myth. The mounds had not been built by Vikings or Welshmen or the lost tribes of Israel or by any race of giants. They had been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples who had lived on that land all along. The same peoples the settlers had looked past, had dismissed as incapable, had pushed off the land. They were the builders. They had always been the builders. The geometry, the astronomy, the engineering, the immense coordinated labor it took to raise those monuments. All of it was theirs. In 1934, a Smithsonian anthropologist named Alish Hrdlicka took on the giant skeleton stories directly and dismantled them. He examined the claims and found no giants. What he found instead, he said, was the will to believe, combined with amateurs who simply did not understand human anatomy well enough to know what they were looking at. A large bone is not a giant. A jumble of remains is not a titan. The skeletons that had terrified and thrilled a nation were ordinary human beings, misread by people who wanted very badly to read them a certain way. And now we come to the question that this entire story has been circling. The question that turns it from a curiosity into something heavier. Why did the myth exist in the first place? Why did so many people, including brilliant and decent people, want so badly to believe that the mounds had been built by a vanished race instead of by the native people standing right in front of them? The answer is not flattering. And it is the real reason this chapter is so rarely told in full. The myth was useful. The myth of the lost race did a particular job, and it did it well. If the magnificent mounds had been built by a noble, vanished people who had themselves been wiped out by the ancestors of the living tribes, then the settlers taking the land were not really stealing anything. They were not displacing the original builders. They were, in the comforting logic of the story, simply reclaiming a land that the current inhabitants had themselves seized from someone greater. The giant builders gave the conquest a clean conscience. It is hard to think of a clearer example of a society inventing exactly the history it needs in order to live with what it is doing. That is what makes Lincoln's sentence so quietly devastating. It is not the sentence of a crank. It is the sentence of one of the most honest and careful men America ever produced, repeating without a flicker of doubt a story that the entire culture around him had absorbed. A story that was false, and a story that served a purpose most of the people repeating it never examined. He wrote it the way you write something you have never once been given a reason to question. And that is how the deepest myths always travel. Not on the lips of liars, but in the offhand certainty of honest people who simply never thought to check. There is a final twist, and it is happening right now, in your lifetime, on the very phone you may be holding. The giants never fully died. The myth went underground, and in the age of the internet it came roaring back wearing a new costume. Around 2014, a story began spreading online claiming that the Smithsonian Institution had secretly destroyed thousands of giant human skeletons in the early 1900s in order to hide the truth about giants from the public. It spread to millions. People believed it. People still believe it. And it is a hoax. It was traced back to a satirical website that publishes invented stories, and it was debunked by Reuters and the Associated Press. The cruel irony is almost too neat. The Smithsonian, the very institution that did the careful work of debunking the giant myth in the first place, is now accused by the believers of covering it up. The truth-tellers have been recast as the conspirators. The myth refuses to die, and every generation it finds a new way to make the lie feel like the secret and the truth feel like the cover story. So what do we do with Abraham Lincoln's sentence? We do not laugh at it. That would be the easy thing and the wrong thing. We sit with it. We let it teach us what it is actually trying to teach. Here was a man of extraordinary intelligence, a man who could stand at the loudest, most overwhelming spectacle on the continent and calmly ask where the water came from, a man who became the conscience of his nation. And even him, wrote down a comfortable national lie as if it were the date on a letter. Not because he was foolish, because the lie was in the air he breathed, and no one had ever handed him a reason to doubt it. That should make every one of us a little quieter, because if Lincoln could do it, so can we. Somewhere in the things we are most certain of, in the history we recite without checking, in the comfortable stories that let us live with ourselves, there are almost certainly giants of our own, beliefs we hold as plain fact that a future generation will gently, patiently dismantle, and then wonder how we ever believed them. The line is real. You can read it tonight. The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. It was written by a great and skeptical man who got it wrong, about a people who were never giants, who built wonders that a nation refused to credit them with, for a reason that nation preferred not to examine. So here is what I want you to do before you close this. Find the fragment. It takes 2 minutes. Read the whole thing in Lincoln's own words. The water and the deep time and the giants and the great extinct beasts. All of it written down on a cold afternoon by a man on his way home. And as you read it, ask yourself the only question that really matters. Not whether the giants were real. They were not. Ask yourself which of your own certainties, the ones you would write down today without a second thought, are giants of your own. Because the mounds were never built by titans. They were built by people we refuse to see. And the most important thing Abraham Lincoln ever taught us about history, Maybe the one sentence he got completely, honestly, and revealingly wrong. The bones were always real. The giants never were. And the difference between those two things is the whole story of how a nation remembers what it would rather forget.